Good afternoon. I would like to thank you all for joining us here today, especially given the change in the date due to the inclement weather a couple of weeks ago. I am Simone Scott Walker. I am a longtime Needham resident as well as a current board member on the Friends of the Needham Library Board. And so we're happy to have you with us here today. And also circling the room who will help me as we get to the Q&A session is Margaret Pantridge, who's also a member of the board and heads up our program committee. She will, and she's also a neighbor. She's the one who got me hooked so about 6 years ago, so I'm grateful that she did that. And so she, along with her fellow peers on the program committee for the Friends, worked tirelessly throughout the year to develop programming that they bring to the library and to the members of the Needham community. And so we're grateful for the work that they do, and especially for helping present the program today with Dr. Landsmark. So thank you all for being here. And as you can see on your interdispersed throughout the chairs are the next programming information. And so we welcome you to come back same time next week to partake in that programming as well. And so without further ado, we'll get on to introducing our speaker here today. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Theodore Landsmark. Today's program is titled Racism in Boston, How Far Have We Come? Dr. Landsmark grew up in New York and then came to Boston as a newly minted Yale lawyer, and in 1976 was headed to a meeting across the Boston City Hall Plaza during the very tumultuous Boston busing desegregation crises when he was attacked by a white teenager wielding a flagpole, as you can see here in this picture here. And as you can see, he will forever be a part of the Boston history because of this award-winning photograph. Dr. Landsmark is currently the director of the Dukakis Center for Urban and Regional Policy and the Distinguished Professor of Practice, where he oversees at Northeastern University interdisciplinary research on urban policy matters, including housing, gentrification, economic development, and transportation, which, if you live here in Needham, it's been a pretty hot topic over the last couple of months. And he's also held various roles within the community, academic, civic, advisory. He's been on a number of boards and trustees of different roles across the Boston area, so he's been very much a very integral member of the Boston community since the 1970s. Today, Dr. Landsmark will share his observations on how life for Bostonians of color has evolved since the 1970s as both a social space and a physical environment. In addition, we anticipate that Dr. Landsmark will speak to the divisions that exist around the country, what they mean, how to address them, and how to transcend all of that to build community, not just within Boston, but also nationally. And so, without further ado, I'll introduce you to Dr. Landsmark.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to see all of you here, and like you, I'm a little disappointed that the weather led to postponement, but here we are. And I'm very appreciative of so many of you coming out on a Sunday afternoon. I'll speak a bit, and then I'm going to call upon some folks to join me in this presentation to add a little bit of context to my comments and remarks. Before I get into anything, you're here because you read my resume and you're aware of the photo and a few other things that I've done. My expectation is that some of you may have some questions that seeing the photograph and knowing my background may have raised for you. So before I start, I'm going to ask whether there are any questions, issues, or subjects that you want to make sure I address in my comments today? Might as well start by knowing that at the outset. Questions or comments that folks may have? Yes.
I wonder if you'll be covering what the result of this incident was.
Certainly. Yes.
Yes, thank you.
Definitely. The result on multiple levels. Anyone else? Sir.
Were you injured as a result of what's going on with everybody?
My nose was broken. And I'll talk just a little bit about that. The fact that my nose was broken led to my ability to choreograph how the most immediate press conference took place afterwards. Anyone else? Yes.
I'd like to ask you to comment on what's happening nationally now with the current administration's attempt to do away with DEI, affirmative action.
We will certainly...
I don't think you could avoid it.
We'll certainly talk about that. My life has centered on working on a number of issues of social justice. When I was growing up in the projects in New York, my mother, a single mom, would make a point of taking me to demonstrations and to other activities that were going on in New York. So I saw Dr. King speak at Riverside Church. We went to the March on Washington in 1963. While I was in college, I went to the March on Selma and was a student making sandwiches in the background of all of the formal activity that was going on at the bridge there. I found myself in a number of places where civil rights activities were taking place. I headed up the Civil Rights Council when I was an undergraduate at Yale. And then when I moved to Boston, I came to work at a now departed law firm, Hill and Barlow, where Mike Dukakis was my boss. Bill Weld had the office across the hall from me. The other black lawyer at the firm, a fellow named Reg Lindsay, was subsequently named to the federal bench. And we had a clear commitment to working on issues of social justice throughout that time. So I've been fortunate to have been in positions where I could be a little bit opportunistic about taking advantage of opportunities to work on a range of social justice issues, even before I went to work in City Hall with Mayors Flynn and Menino, and now indirectly with Mayor Wu. So my life has been largely driven by the opportunities I've had to work on social justice issues. Clearly I have some thoughts and opinions on what's going on in Washington at this moment. We'll get to those. And I hope that folks will think of our conversation today as a conversation in a safe space. I am teaching at Northeastern in the public policy school, and we make a point of saying at the beginning of our classes that we can't guarantee that we're going to be in entirely safe spaces all the time in terms of our conversations. But we hope that folks will be open and honest and authentic in expressing their viewpoints. I may say some things that folks disagree with, and that's okay. I would hope that if you do have some disagreement, that you'll be honest and upfront about sharing that, My understanding is that this is a community where people have been vocal on a number of issues recently, and I hope that you will share that kind of authenticity and a willingness to share your ideas in this setting as well. I think there may be one person here from the media, but I don't think that this conversation is going to be anything that'll be archived in a way that will necessarily lead to angst subsequently. The other question is there anything that folks want to be absolutely certain I cover, other than your question? Yes?
I would be interested in your observations about segregation, both residential and economic segregation in the metropolitan Boston area. Whether it's getting better or worse, and what factors are influencing any trends that you see.
I will speak to that. It hasn't gone away, to be sure. And for many of us who've worked in this area for any length of time, that is a very deep and a great frustration. The greater Boston area has a very long history, going back centuries, of racial segregation, and to a large extent, while the overt discrimination may not be quite as apparent, the covert discrimination continues. And I remind many of my colleagues, one of whom I see in the audience, that as much as we've overcome some issues around education and around voting, when one looks at residential patterns, when one looks at corporate hiring patterns, when one looks at the composition of who attends our universities and who works in our biotech and finance fields, when one looks at patterns of promotion within our major universities and the like, we are still operating on a bunch of racially driven and racist premises. There are fewer African American students, for example, enrolled in Northeastern today than was the case 10 years ago. And that is the case for many of our major universities. The universities have focused on increasing diversity over the past decade or two. But much of that diversity has come in the form of admitting very large numbers of international students who have certainly contributed significantly to the discourse that we have in our classes. But that has happened at the same time that the numbers of Latino and African American students have actually declined in almost all of our major universities. And the numbers of faculty of color within our universities continue to be minuscule, in most cases less than 2 or 3%. So as much as we have experienced change in the greater Boston area at a number of levels, it's also quite clear that there are incipient patterns of discrimination and racism that continue to drive our policies and practices in this part of the world, and that we need to be sensitive to those. And that, in fact, is one of the key reasons that when I'm invited to do a talk like this, I do it. Because we need to be open and honest with ourselves about how good we are, and also, after all of these decades of hard work, how much we've fallen short of our expectations around addressing issues and patterns of endemic racism, not just in Boston, but really across New England. And I'll add one other footnote to that. I was asked to do some consulting a couple of years ago on higher education across the New England region. And New England is a funny place. All of the geography of the 6 states of New England could fit inside of Georgia or could fit inside of Washington State. We think of ourselves as being very large and influential, but as a geographic area and as a population center, we're no bigger than Georgia is. And yet we have the 6 jurisdictions with various boards and commissions that oversee higher education and public safety and transportation issues and the like. And when one looks across the 6 states in terms of higher education and in terms of many of those institutions, the fact of the matter is that there are fewer people of color in positions of authority across our 6 states than one finds in a place like Georgia. Fewer than one finds in a place like Mississippi. And we pride ourselves on being very progressive around many of these social justice issues, but the fact of the matter is that the actual demographics don't begin to reflect the patterns of life that have become endemic throughout New England. But I'll expand upon that just a little bit. I grew up in public housing in East Harlem in New York. Spent a lot of time in my local church, and through that I met a young seminarian who suggested that I apply to an Ivy League college, which I did, knowing that I wouldn't get in. In those days, there were very few of us who were admitted to the Harvards and Yales. But after Yale turned me down, they suggested that I do a finishing year at St. Paul's School, a private preparatory school up in Concord, New Hampshire. And I did that and reapplied and ended up at Yale as an undergraduate who was actively involved with a number of social justice issues. I became head of the Yale Civil Rights Council and political editor of the Yale Daily News, and ended up going to Selma, Alabama, and the March on Washington, and a number of other activities where I was privileged to be able to interact with Dr. King and Fannie Lou Hamer and a number of other civil rights leaders who gave me a sense of purpose in terms of my own youthful enthusiasm for trying to change the world. And then I moved to Boston and went to work at the Hill and Barlow law firm, where, as I say, Mike Dukakis was my boss and Bill Weld had the office across the hall, and I got to know a little bit about New England law and culture. I also got to learn a lot about being a lawyer, which I realized I hated. And so I left that firm after 2 years and have worked ever since then in a number of community settings, working with community groups in Roxbury, doing a lot of work with the arts, serving on the boards of the ICA and the MFA, running a small art gallery down in the Fort Point Channel area, doing a lot of research on early African American artisanry. I was asked to oversee a program to inspire young African Americans in Boston to do something other than joining gangs. And it struck me that early on in American history, there had to have been a number of African Americans who were craftsmen and artisans, and that if I could identify some of those people, I might be able to say to the guys in the street, look, there are people who have made beautiful objects over the years, and you could follow in that path rather than following the path of criminal activity. And that research took me to the Museum of Fine Arts, and then to the Metropolitan New York, and then museums in the South, and ultimately I spent years driving around, primarily in South Carolina and Georgia, looking for artisanry made by enslaved people and by African Americans in the 19th century. And I bring that up because I continue to believe that the arts play a role in helping to inspire young people, particularly young people who may not necessarily feel that they have a future in traditional professions, but that they might in fact have a future as artists and artisans who also contribute to the culture. And I believe very deeply, particularly given the amount of immigration that we have now coming into our region, that if we can help emerging groups to identify their own cultural artifacts, that we can help encourage them to become part of what the New England culture is. And that helps us to develop a greater sense of respect and understanding of the diversity of cultures that exist within this region. I should also note that I've had opportunities to work on a number of projects within the city of Boston that have brought about some significant improvements. Under Mayor Flynn, I headed up a program called the Safe Neighborhoods Program, where we engaged in a number of activities that were designed to help reduce the murder rate within the city of Boston as one of the indices of the city's overall health. And over a 2-year period, we were able to cut the murder rate by 80%. And we went through a 2-year period where there wasn't a single teenager who was killed in the city. And of course, we made a point of giving the credit for that success to community groups and people in the neighborhoods who worked together with public safety and with public health people and with local realtors to engage community people as mentors who could then help to focus the energies of young people who might otherwise have become involved with gang activity. And that was a great success. And during that same period, we ran a program called Healthy Boston. And Healthy Boston also involved a number of community people. And under the aegis of that program, we changed the infant mortality rate in the city of Boston, which at the beginning had been at a level equal to the infant mortality rate in Bangladesh, to the lowest infant mortality rate in the United States. But all of that came about because of our ability to involve communities in assessing in different ways than many of us as professionals did, assessing what the real solutions to the problems might be. And if there's anything that I hope that folks come away from this conversation with, it's the sense that all of us, in fact, play a role as people who involve communities and engage with communities. We all play a role in listening to the people we purport to serve, in listening closely to their interpretations of how they would go about solving their problems. And that as smart as we are, and as engaged as we are, we owe it to the people we serve to hear from them as to what they think the solutions are that would help to resolve some of the social justice issues that we try to deal with. So let me talk about some of the work that we do now within the policy school, and some of the work that I've been working on over the past few years to engage communities in helping to address their own problems internally and helping communities to work in ways where they are empowered to solve their problems as much as they receive benefit from our expertise as working professionals and as university people. We've been working in Grove Hall, a section of Roxbury, part of Dorchester, on developing with local people a set of interventions that will make that neighborhood more directly sustainable and resilient. We anticipate that there will be flooding in Boston, as there will be throughout this region. And we can either come to a community as engineers and as policy planners and as architects and urban planners and designers and present the community with solutions for addressing what will almost certainly be flooding and devastation when the big storms come. And that's inevitable. But we can also engage local people in understanding the nature of the ecology and the nature of the environmental factors that will have a negative impact on their communities when the storms come. And so we've been working in Grove Hall and in a couple of other areas, in Franklin Park and Franklin Field, around enabling folks in the communities, gardeners, people who are involved with horticultural activity, people who understand the land in the area. We've been working with them to help them develop a deeper and broader understanding of the ways in which they can help themselves to stave off environmental degradation in their communities. And we've been doing that with a number of students who've worked with the trustees and with the Massachusetts Horticultural Society and with other community-based gardening groups that are leaving behind not just a legacy of having grown beautiful things, but the knowledge necessary for people to be able to sustain their own environmental quality within their neighborhoods and, in fact, to improve that quality. We've been working on doing workforce development with young people through a program called Community to Communities, where we've been working here in Boston and in Oakland, California, to engage young people who've been involved with criminal justice activities to develop skill sets that they can use to move into the, well, what we used to call the new green economy. And whether that continues to exist given impending budget cuts remains an open question, but the commitment remains to work with young people, to empower them to understand that as we move forward with new ways of thinking about and looking at energy use, that they're going to be a part of that. And that through their activities around infrastructure improvements or construction work or renovation work that goes on in the communities, or planning work or horticulture, that in fact young people will have longer-term careers that they might not ever have anticipated having. And that our students within Northeastern can learn to work directly with communities in ways that will enable our students, as they become professionals, to move into the firms, to move into engineering, to move into AI, to move into tech, but to do so with an understanding of who the beneficiaries of their professional work will be. And so we've been working hard to connect universities, which aren't going anywhere in the greater Boston area, to the communities that we serve. We've also been working to get our key institutions Boston's a funny town, let me digress just a bit. We're a city of about 650,000 people. But of that 650,000, about 250,000 are tied into universities, and they rarely make a commitment to being real neighbors and residents within their communities. I often say to my next door neighbors who are graduate students that the best they can do, they often complain about gentrification and the cost of living in the city. And I often point out to them that the best they can do is get to know who their neighbors are and really take advantage of the city as a cultural and a neighborly resource for them. Because we as neighbors who've been there for a while want to get to know them, and we hope that they want to get to know us as well. And in that regard, you look at a city of 650,000 where about a third of the people disappear and cycle out every year, then you realize that we're really a city of only about 400 to 450,000 people. That's a very small town. And that if we make the effort to build up communications networks among ourselves, if we get to know our neighbors, in fact, we can be assets to them, and they in turn can be assets to us as we try to work to move the city forward. And that takes me back to this photo, which I am well known as the subject of. What was important to me about this photo was not so much that it happened, but what's important was what happened after. This happened in early April in 1976, which was a bicentennial year. And the entire region was at that point gearing up for all kinds of very lucrative bicentennial activities to take place across the city. And it was clear to us, those of us who were involved in social justice activities at that time, employment and training and housing activities, it was clear to us that at that moment we had leverage with public officials and corporate leaders to try to get them to respond to the needs that had been expressed by people of color in the city who'd been underserved for many generations. And so a group of us came together immediately after this. I didn't organize them. I'd only been here for a couple of years. But the people came to me and they said, you know, a horrible thing has happened to you here, but maybe we can make some lemonade out of these lemons. And they set up a series of meetings, very similar to this one, that brought together religious leaders and community activists and people who cared about the city and where the city seemed to be going. And we then put together a series of dialogues around the city. We contacted churches and synagogues in particular because it was in the run-up to Easter and Passover. And we began a series of conversations to talk about what really mattered in the city and what these kinds of images and what the image that was going out about Boston across the country, really across the world, was doing to diminish not only how we felt about ourselves, but our longer-term economic prospects, the shame that much of the city was starting to feel about itself because of these kinds of activities. And by engaging people across the city, in Southie and Roxbury and in many of our suburbs, what began to happen was that many of our corporate leaders and public officials began to say, you know, there are things that we could have been doing to address these issues of racial justice within the city, and things that we still could do. And those things were very small things, but they began to make a difference. One began to see salespeople of color in Filene's basement. One began to see wait staff in restaurants on Newbury Street who were people of color. One began to see black and brown bus drivers and toll takers in the MBTA stations. One began to see black and brown clerks within the state court system. One began to see teachers being hired and teachers' assistants being hired who hadn't been hired before. What happened was that through considerable amounts of community engagement and dialogue, we were able to engage people who felt that busing was something that didn't have an impact on them, and that they were in a position, through their professional positions within the city, to hire and to mentor and to begin to support folks within our communities who needed the help and support. Did we make huge progress? No. Did we begin to make inroads in employment and in education into many of our institutions? Yes, we did. And those began to lay a foundation for longer-term change within the city. So here we are now in 2024, and the question comes up nearly a half century later as to what it is ultimately we ended up accomplishing through all of those activities at that point in time. And the harsh reality is that we haven't accomplished much. I looked at some data on admissions policies for all of our major colleges. And at many of our schools, there are fewer African American and Latin students enrolled in our major colleges today than there were 20 years ago. I look at a number of our industries, law and finance and engineering, the industries that have driven the economy in Greater Boston. And in most of those industries, there are about equal numbers of people of color working in those industries today as there were 10 years ago. I look at our housing segregation patterns, and Boston is either the first or second most racially segregated city in the country in terms of where people actually live. So despite all of the good efforts that were made, we're falling short in terms of what we could be and what we hold ourselves out to be as a city that's committed to social justice. And I think it's safe to say that given the policies that are projected to come out of Washington and that are already coming out of Washington, which are wiping out affirmative action and DEI programs, I shudder to think of the directions that we're heading in terms of whether in fact we will become a more diverse city. The fact is that we are more diverse in terms of who lives here now, substantially so. We've been a so-called majority-minority city for a decade, but you wouldn't know that if you wandered through most of our downtown. You wouldn't know that if you go into most of our professional offices. You wouldn't know that as you walk through our college campuses. You wouldn't know that in most of the places where we generate capital and where we generate the ability to sink a root in Boston, to buy a home, to attend a school of one's choice. The numbers are not nearly as good as they need to be. And the question is, why is that? Why is it that there is, in a relative sense, so little change since then in terms of how we as a community welcome new people? What is the inertia that exists that enables us to continue to hold immigrants at arm's length or to vote against improvements in housing access tied in with our transportation systems, or that prevent us from changing zoning that in ways that would enable us to put together units of housing that serves the families who are moving into our neighborhoods and growing the city at this moment. And to that extent, I have to say again that we have to do now what we did back then, which is to hold a mirror up to ourselves and to ask ourselves whether we're prepared to make many of the hard choices that have to be made in order to address the issues which are not so much endemic issues, but they're issues with how we deal with ourselves and our neighbors and our new neighbors and the more diverse culture that we've become. I want to try to answer that by doing something that was not on my original agenda, but which I think will be enlightening for all of us because we're here. In the preliminary conversation before I began to speak, it turns out that there are two members of the audience who lived through busing in Boston and who can talk a little bit about their experience and what they experienced afterwards to help bring about a certain amount of healing in the community. So I'm going to invite them up. Bob, you want to come on up? David, you want to come on up? We're going to put two chairs up here. As you can see, they'd never met before. So Bob, you want to start off?
Ted and I, Theodore, we've known each other for almost 40 years, so no disrespect with calling him Ted. I think it's almost 40 years. I think 87 we were in Lead Boston.
Yeah.
So that goes back a few years. Currently, we're both on the Boston Desegregation and Busing Initiative over 2 years now, and that initiative was brought together by Carolyn Crockett, a professor at MIT, I believe, and Lou Finfa, who's just an unbelievable organizer. And that was to draw attention to the 50th anniversary, if you would, of busing, which was in this past September, was 50 years. So, and we did a series of forums, and you can catch it either through PBS. There was a documentary called The Busing Battleground, and also through South Boston Association of Nonprofits, which I'm a member of. And I want to speak about courageous conversations, because I think that speaks to a community trying to grapple and continue to deal with race and racism. Background on this photo here, these young folks, I believe, were all students. And they just left a meeting, I think was at City Hall. I think, I know Louise Day Hicks was there. I know Dapper, over my dead body, are these buses going to roll up the hill? They rolled up the next day. O'Neill. And John Kerrigan, who, if you look at the school committee minutes, and you've seen this, refers to the black students as monkeys. And they got these kids all riled up. And they went from, I think they were at City Hall, and they were going to march to the courthouse. And it was all about stopping forced busing. So the narrative, this is April, and then you've got the tall ships coming in July, and then you got busing, and some folks would call it forced busing, that started in September. So with all of the good work, there was a parallel piece of work going on. I'm born and raised in Southie, still live there. And the narrative was, we got to stop forced busing. This is coming out of the blue. Where did this come from? You know, I'm ashamed it took me almost, 40 plus years. Like, it didn't come out of the blue. You look at some of the Boston School Committee, they intentionally segregated, and they intentionally had the unequal distribution of resources in the black schools and the white schools. In their own minutes, the lawyers from NAACP said it was the easiest decision they ever had to make. They just look at the minutes of the school committee, every single meeting minutes, and they just looked at the, so they held the city hostage. 6-7 minutes of that school committee were never held accountable. There were no, as Ira Jackson says, there were no profiles of courage here. No elected, the governor, nothing. The mayor at that point was white. Nobody did anything to stop these 6-7 members of the school committee from causing this terror that happened with the reaction to stop forced busing. So these kids were trying to stop forced busing. We, at that time, I'm 20, we bought the narrative that this came out of the blue. It didn't. They had many opportunities to come up with a plan so that the plan that was put in place hastily, there wasn't a lot of time to actually implement the plan. And at that point, there were a core group of racists from the South Boston Information Center. There were mothers who were part of ROAR. And then there were other parents who were just like, wait a minute, I got to put my kid on a bus to go to a school and go to a neighborhood that I don't know anything about. And I think there were some legitimate concerns about that plan. You put all that together, and then you look at what happened in September, the riots, people throwing, bricks. It was just horrible. And that image is just seared in the image of Boston as well. If there's a chance, I'm carrying on here, my friend, sorry. I'll talk a little bit about the Association of Nonprofits and Courageous Conversations, because I think that's important in the context of a neighborhood trying to continue to grapple with busing, the impact that still lives today, and our efforts to try to address that as well.
Yeah, we'll get back to that in a minute. Did you introduce yourself?
Oh, I probably didn't.
Sorry. Who are you anyway?
My name's Bob Monahan. I'm a lifelong resident of South Boston. So in '76, I was 20, and I was part of a lot of these marches and rallies, etc. I was not part of that one. I worked for nonprofits for almost 48 years. Started with community centers, which was community schools, right after I graduated from college in '76. And then I worked for Boys and Girls Clubs of Boston for over 20 years. And then I spun out a program that I started for a family development program. So I pretty much after 48 years have been involved with youth development and family development, and recently retired about 2 years ago, which gave me a lot of time to participate in the citywide desegregation and busing initiative.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm David Walker, Needham resident, and I am a third-generation Needham resident. My grandparents in the 60s lived on West Street, and my mother and uncle actually graduated from Needham High. And Simone and I were living in Texas, and we moved back 2018?
2011.
Oh, okay. I was close. It's interesting seeing these pictures, and my grandmother was a district superintendent during busing, and the district she had encompassed South Boston, and so that's when a lot of resistance was met to some of the students being bused in, and so I would hear these stories from time to time when we had dinner over there. And it was shocking. I guess I was somewhat isolated because I went to private school. I went to Belmont Hill, and nothing like that ever happened. And so it's interesting hearing how my grandmother had to deal with those problems. And I tell the story, nothing against South Boston. It's just a handful of people that just, I would say, just behaved inappropriately.
There was a healing process that took place after this. People going out to churches and community centers and efforts to bring folks together as between the suburbs and the city around all of this. Could you folks talk about that and talk about it in particular relation to today and some of the issues that folks are dealing with today, which are in part still racial and have divided the country.
You want to start with that?
And, you know, some of the folks that were involved with the healing process, Tracy Maffetano, who was on the Parents Advisory Council, or there was a citywide group, she lived right across the street from me in South Boston. And the marshals, that's what they're called, the South Boston Information Center ROAR group, came out with a flyer that basically called her out for being part of this healing group. And it was a group that was fostering communication mostly around parents who had kids in school, Roxbury, Southie, and other neighborhoods. And they called out, without naming her, that we're not going to tolerate traitors like this. I just happened to be outside, it was the summer, and these mob of kids came out of nowhere, hockey sticks, bats. They busted up her car. They threw bricks through the windows, thinking she was on the first floor. She was on the second floor. So her mother and grandmother got hurt with this, and nothing ever happened. It took a long time for the cops to come. And the message was, you're a traitor. If you're going to try to make this busing plan work and be part of the healing process. So as much effort as there were, and particularly the Sisters of Notre Dame, I know, were very active and actually on the buses, meeting the kids at Columbia Park, Columbia Point, where the buses gathered. So there were folks who were really trying to help. And then when you think of an incident like that, it sends a chill to folks that might want to try. And then we were told, don't ever talk about busing. And we'll get back to this maybe with courageous conversations, because nothing good is ever going to happen if you talk about busing. And what I've learned is that's because the folks that were most involved and complicit in this, they would have been exposed. So don't talk about this. But we should have talked about it. It didn't come out of the blue, this decision. And those who were most at fault with forcing this to happen escaped, except for after several years when they didn't stop force busing, they got elected out. And then, as Ted knows, Mayor Flynn did something that was outrageous, and he was going to do away with the elected school committee, which was a bunch of clowns at the time, and that's putting it mildly. And he won, so that the mayor appointed the the school committee. So that actually helped calm things down for a while as well.
Yeah, and I was in the middle of coordinating that activity, and for me, as a person who had worked on voting rights in the South and getting people engaged in the political process, to get the voters in Boston to vote to eliminate their elected school committee was really a major uphill battle and a tough ethical issue for me to have to deal with. But we did it because of the level of ineptitude and also corruption that had existed within the then school committee. And we were able to persuade many of the black clergy in the city to come along with us to encourage members of their constituencies to vote to eliminate the vote. And we won. And I then chaired the committee that appointed the first appointed school committee in the city.
Two things. The stories that my grandmother used to tell about all the difficulties in South Boston slowly but surely became less and less frequent. And so progress was being made. The other tangential data point, at Belmont Hill, my class was fairly small. Freshman year, I want to say maybe 55, 60 boys. And one of the new kids to the class was from South Boston, and one of the nicest kids that you would ever meet. And so, may not have answered the question, but just data points that I observed. and how things improved from the stonings and things like that.
And part of that improvement, you're absolutely right, that things did, quote, calm down. But many of the folks that had kids in school moved out. They went to Weymouth, they went to Norwell. Many of them regret it because they could never come back into Southie now because they couldn't afford it. So that was part of it. And then there were a number of white kids who just didn't go to school anymore. But then parents tried to get them into parochial schools and private schools. So there was a surrender that, the town, we lost Southie High, we lost our schools, and especially Southie High, and disengaged with being involved in the public schools, except for the poorest of the, black Latinos and whites, mostly whites who were in the projects at the time, housing developments at the time, Oak Colony, Mary Ellen McCormick, and D Street. They didn't have any choice, so they continued to go to school, but the madness of the rock throwing and the fights and the rallies just stopped because this was not going to go anywhere, and we lost the battle. That's how it felt. This was a fight, and you lost the fight, and that's it.
So, what for me is the takeaway from all of this? Bad things happen. The question is, what do you learn from them, and to what extent is one prepared to confront those bad things and to engage in dialogue around developing some sense of common ground across shared beliefs? There wasn't anyone in this process who was an advocate for bad schools in and of themselves. Most of the folks made the argument that they were trying to improve the schools or protect what they were doing. But clearly, there weren't people who were prepared to step up to facilitate conversations to make it possible for a resolution other than busing. And had there been people who were prepared to step up to negotiate substantive change, transformative change, then maybe all of this could have been avoided. And that, for me, raises the question of where we are at this moment as the city looks forward and as the country looks forward. We're obviously in very divided times. And we live within the context of our devices that keep feeding us information within the bubble within which we exist. And the question is, can we find and train and really develop the mediators among us who can begin to bring us back together around some of the key issues that we're trying to deal with, whether it's taxing or gentrification or transportation access or DEI or all of the environmental issues that we have to deal with. And the question is, how do we identify those mediators and those peacemakers who can in fact bring us back together? Ultimately, there were folks who did come forward during busing to play that role. And ultimately, those folks exist today. So for me, when I see this photo, I think of a moment in time half a century ago, and I'm often asked to speak about it to the extent that folks want to know, well, how did you feel? Well, how I felt was obviously rudely offended by the activities, but then, and more importantly now, I think the issue is, how do we identify those peacemakers among us, those mediators, who can come forward and begin to help us identify the key issues, whether they're environmental or social justice or gender-based or whatever. How do we find those mediators who can, in fact, begin to bring us back together? So for me, the image there is, it's an image that carries with it a little bit of terror, but it also carries with it a sense of hope about what it is that we can begin to think about as we try to heal, particularly around issues of equity and social justice. Bob?
One group that I'm very hopeful about, Ted, is the nonprofit community. The community I know the best is South Boston, South Boston Association of Nonprofits. There's actually a subcommittee that's teaming up with, I don't know who's leading it, Mass Water and so, I'm not sure, but taking seriously the flooding that's coming and looking at, there's already a map, you know, Moakley Park, you're underwater. Right now I'm on East 7th Street. I'll have waterfront property with next time the storm comes, but it's going to wipe out about a whole bunch. So taking that seriously, but also the nonprofits, we did something what we felt was very courageous. Right after the murder of George Floyd, a very emotional time for everybody. And we provided space, and this gets, I think the nonprofit group, certainly churches and others, is one possibility of folks that are already showing leadership and may continue and will continue to show leadership. We provided space for our staff, and there was, you know, a fair amount of diversity amongst our staff, just to express feelings, and those were on Zoom at the time. And the topic, it wasn't so much about policing, race and racism in Boston and the history and the legacy, that kept coming up. And busing kept coming up. And we decided, I was on the board at the time, we said, it's time to talk about busing. And we called them Courageous Conversations. And in 50 years, well, at that point, 47, nobody ever took the leadership to take on this topic. And actually, Ted and Mayor Flynn were on one of the forums, you know, that we did. And for us, we felt that was the right name, Courageous Conversations, because no one else took this up, this topic. And we addressed it, we confronted it, and we continue to do efforts to continue this dialogue. So that's one suggestion, Ted. In my observation, nonprofits and not one elected official said anything. They were all aware. We made their staffs all aware of what we were doing. They had opportunities to participate in the forums. They didn't, but they didn't do anything to stop us either.
I think we have time for one or two questions or comments. Yes?
Hi, Bob. It's good to see you again. I'd just like to say we're all here because we're really interested in our view of race in Boston, and I don't think we can get to that without an understanding of the history. And each one of our histories and our approach to Boston is going to be different depending on how we experienced it, where we lived, etc. David is such a good example of that. And I would like to just recommend 3 resources. Over the last 2 to 3 years, there's been a big move to document the history of Boston and look at the racial history of Boston. So PBS, the busing underground, is amazing. You get the story visually, and you get the voices. You get the courageous voices. We all gathered with the mayor to screen it, and they had counselors there with us, and there was people from South Boston, people from, I mean, just from all across the city. A very diverse look. So PBS's busing underground is good. Battleground, underground. We're not underground anymore. The second is Murder in Boston. And the third, which I think everybody would love, is coming out March 3rd. I don't work for HBO, but Celtic City. 9 parts, and it runs the history of race in Boston parallel with the Celtics experience. So if anybody wants to dive into the history and really go through these conversations and get a look, for me, I grew up in Dedham. Okay, I live in Boston, but it filled in a number of the pieces.
Thank you.
Yes?
I love this idea that we need to know each other and listen first and foremost, and knowing each other's history is part of that process, as is self-reflecting. In Needham, there's a lot going on. So our high school students are training in courageous conversations on race, and are facilitating conversations for their peers and also in the community. And that is now extending, so keep your eyes open that we will continue the community conversations on race in the coming month or two. We have facilitators, Dr. Gary Bailey, who works at Simmons, who's been part of this process and part of the real coalition of the school district, is going to be leading some of those. And I think it's important for everyone to come and understand your own experience with race, and we all need to do this work and then be able to understand what we could do to step in. And I have a lot of questions, but I won't raise them now, but thank you.
We'll be here. Anyone else?
I'd like to know how you feel about Black History Month. You are our Black History Month speaker, which we appreciate. But some people are even saying, oh, there shouldn't be a Black History Month anymore. How do you feel about it?
You know, it's funny, when I was working in the mayor's office on anti-violence activities, I started to look for heroes within the African American community who weren't athletes or entertainers or teachers, for that matter. And that's what got me looking for makers of African American antiques. I knew that there had to have been craftspeople in the 18th and 19th century who must have made things that still exist today, that could be viewed as artifacts of intellectual and handcraft. And when I started doing that, which was 30 years ago, whatever, I didn't get much support for that kind of activity, except during periods of Black history attention, where at least initially the focus was on the Black doctors or the Black college presidents who had existed in the 19th and early 20th century. But slowly but surely, what has happened is that as we pay attention to the range of ways in which cultures express themselves, not only in terms of traditional leadership, but in terms of artisanry and craftsmanship, we've seen a rise in the level of awareness of the contributions that different groups have made to American culture. And we're seeing that now within Asian cultures and African cultures. And one of the benefits of bringing that kind of attention, which seems to have upset a lot of people in Washington who are concerned about the fact that we're now woke and aware of the multiple histories that have made up what American culture is at this moment, that as we bring more attention to those artistic and other forms, that we are stronger as a culture because we can see the extent to which various groups within American society have contributed in a variety of ways. And there is now much more archaeological work and work on ancestry and work on historical archaeology that involves our multiple cultures than there was 10, 15, 20 years ago. And I think part of that is because people have raised the issues on the streets, but it's also partly a response to the efforts that all of our cultures have made. And I think Black History Week, Black History Month are a part of that process of raising the awareness of the multiple contributions that different cultures have made to America. Sir.
I'm curious because I don't remember. What happened to the fellow who attacked you with the flag in terms of the criminal justice system? And also, did you ever end up meeting him and having a conversation with him?
Well, the short answer is that he's living on the coast of Maine. His family was involved with waterfront activities, and so he was one of the Southie kids who was able to get a job as a stevedore on the docks. But he was also involved in subsequent violent activity, which under other circumstances would have resulted in Southie justice, which would have meant that he would have been disappeared. But his brother was a business agent for the union, and so he was spared and was permitted to move to the coast of Maine and continue his work on the docks. And he lives there now, and he's been interviewed since then probably only once or twice. And he has declined to have any kind of meeting with me. I mean, I guess I'd be willing to sit down with him, although I don't know what we would talk about. He is still out there, basically. I won't say in hiding, but he is still out there living on the coast of Maine.
Never faced any punishment?
All of the 4 young men who were arrested, of the 4, none had criminal records. And they were arrested the next day because there were photographs of them. And they were known in the community. And I was presented with the choice of pursuing legal activity against them or accepting their apologies. And it struck me that my voice and leverage would be greater if I didn't pursue legal action. They had gotten caught up in the moment. They didn't really have any assets worth pursuing, and it didn't make sense to me to pursue them. But it did make sense to me to use that platform as a way of addressing the issues, particularly because it was a bicentennial year. And everyone was planning on coming to Boston, and there was real economic leverage. There was a group that came together and I shouldn't use the word threatened, but offered to run full-page ads in the Washington Post and the New York Times, telling people not to come to Boston during the bicentennial year because of the risk that they might be hurt. And word of that initiative got to then Senate President Billy Bulger, who then contacted then Representative Mel King to try to get those of us who might be involved with that ad to back off. And we in turn then put together some meetings with some corporate and public policy leaders in Boston to say that we would only not run the ad if there were other concessions that were made, particularly around employment in the public sector and in some of the retail stores. So the kids themselves went their way. I have since met some of the kids who were part of the demonstration, but none of the 4 who were arrested, and I went my way.
I wonder if you could comment on any progress or lack thereof in the Boston Public Schools over the last 50 years. So what do you see as a result of busing in terms of any improvement in equity in the system?
Well, the schools are much better than they were for a variety of reasons, and it's not clear that any of those improvements are attributable to busing in and of itself. Indeed, I've always taken the position that there's very little learning that goes on in a 45-minute bus ride to and from, home and school. I was one of the first young people to be bused in New York City after Brown versus Board of Education. So I know what the experience of being on a bus for 45 minutes each way is, and there's no contribution to your learning that takes place. And in Boston, busing also divorced young people from their home communities and from the support systems that existed, whether it was merchants or parents or other family members or what have you. So I have not seen a study that indicated that busing in and of itself improved learning outcomes. And there's a lot of work that suggests that busing diminished a lot of social activities and learning activities for kids because they weren't attached to their neighborhoods. And it's also clear that busing diminished the ability of parents to connect with their schools and administrators and teachers in the schools, because the parents who are working and otherwise engaged often can't get to a school on the other side of the city to work with a teacher around improving learning. So my own view for a number of years has been that it's probably time to end busing in its current form and redirect those funds into educational improvements in the individual schools. So there'll always be some busing for kids with handicaps and certain kids who need it. But we spend millions of dollars a year on a transportation system that pollutes and doesn't guarantee improved learning outcomes.
Broken nose. Somebody asked you if your nose was broken, and I think that also addresses the what you did immediately afterwards, as opposed to prosecuting the kids.
Yeah, my nose was broken, not by the flag. The flag never touched me. It was being swung, so it missed me by inches. But the first guy to hit me, who is the tall person with a light-colored jacket whose back is turned, did break my nose when he hit me. And, it was messy, to be sure. Broken noses sort of make a lot of mess. So when I got over to Mass General, there was a young doc there, young African-American doctor, who said to me, we can just fix it very easily. We'll just click the pieces back together and put a bandage on it, or we can really bandage you up so it looks as though you've been attacked by all these people. Which is your preference? I said, give me the full deal. And so for a couple of days after, I was wearing this bandage that was kind of like a hockey mask, which I look back now and I didn't realize how media savvy I was at the time. But media savvy to the extent of having a Pulitzer Prize-winning photographer handy at the moment, and then managing the press afterwards. But the entire event, and I think this is what's really important, particularly looking forward, the entire event really did lead to a series of discussions and conversations and discourses throughout the greater Boston area, where a lot of people who felt that busing was something that was isolated to Southie and maybe Roxbury was really something that involved the entire community within 128. Because Judge Garrity could have mandated a different solution. He could have mandated a metropolitan solution that would have involved the suburbs and the inner city rather than involving two working class communities within the city going at each other. Neither Southie nor Roxbury had much to offer in terms of quality education. But if a metropolitan-wide solution had been developed, as was the case in a number of other American cities, there would have been more of an exchange that would have exposed all of the kids in Boston to mentors and better learning opportunities. And that didn't happen. So, you know, looking back, we've learned a bit about how to try to develop solutions that share the burden and share the responsibility and the accountability for improving the particular situation. And again, we think of that now. You know, I'm still involved with policy making in Boston. We think about that now around a whole range of issues, transportation issues. The city of Boston can't solve the MBTA problem. Opioid addiction issues. The city of Boston, Mass and Cass, is viewed as the center of opioid addiction, but it's a region-wide problem. It's a national problem. And so the solutions have to be regional. Gentrification in the city and the housing of hundreds of thousands of college students. Everyone looks to Boston or Cambridge to solve that, but it's really a region-wide issue. And so there are a lot of planning issues, and this was a precursor to some of those, that can really only be resolved through metropolitan-wide strategic and tactical solutions. And I think the challenge that a lot of public planners have at this moment is one of trying to bring all of our municipalities together to try to solve these problems as a group, rather than just looking to Chelsea to fix opioids or Quincy to fix housing. And that's something that we've not been very good at over the last couple of centuries. Yeah, there's one other hand.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for coming and sharing your thoughts. I'm just wondering if these last remarks of yours would strongly favor expansion of the METCO program.
I've not been a fan of the METCO program. And I've been kind of outspoken about that. I spent some time at Harvard Ed studying learning outcomes. And one of the things I learned is that a key factor in the improved learning outcomes of a kid is the aspiration level of the kid's parent and mother in particular. That if a mother really wants the very best for a kid, there's a higher probability that that kid will succeed educationally. And what METCO has done from my perspective, as a kid who was bused, I was among the first 4 kids to be bused in New York City after Brown. And I spent about 45 minutes each way a day being bused from where I lived in Harlem to Inwood, which was a primarily Jewish school in the upper end of Manhattan. I didn't learn anything on the bus. I learned a lot when I got to my public school in Inwood. But what I also learned was that I ceased to be a member of my home community because I wasn't around for that. And I couldn't be in the school community long enough to become a member of the school community. And so my personal development, my social development, my intellectual development was at a very high level. But my ability to, interact with other kids, I learned a lot about interacting with kids who were different than myself, but I never developed that set of relationships that you develop from hanging out with the kids in your neighborhood. And I wasn't able to develop a set of relationships with the kids at the recipient school. And I've spoken to a number of Metco kids over the years who've told me exactly the same thing. I've spoken to the black girls who said, I could never get a date, either at the recipient school or in my home community. And I've spoken to, the guys who had graffiti scrawled on their football lockers and who felt that they weren't in a position to complain about that for fear that they would then be thrown out of the program. And so from my perspective, Metco, which I think has served the recipient communities well in terms of enabling them to expose suburban kids to black kids from the inner city, and has served the kids in the inner city well by exposing them to young people whose aspirations, or parents whose aspirations would lead them to become lawyers or AI engineers. I think it's worked out well for the kids, but I think it has diminished the ability of communities to support their kids as learners. And I think it has taken out of those communities not just the kids, but the parents who in many respects have the highest ambition levels for their children. And when you remove those parents from the local schools, then you don't have that kind of confident engagement with the local school that you would have if those parents could just walk over to the school and talk to the school principal. So I think that Metco, which came into being years before busing, right? Several years before busing, Metco was designed and came into being. I think it served a purpose as a transition. But I think that given the changed demographics of the schools, who's in the schools now, and what the funding could be that could be transferred from buses to books or to computers, from my own perspective, Metco has served its purpose well and could now be phased out.
And I think with that, we'll make that the last question. I don't know if you have any parting comments you'd like to make, Dr. Landsmark, as you...
Thank you all for coming out on a Sunday afternoon. And thanks to our guests.